Hi, I'm Liam Karen, and this is Architecture Topics, the podcast where buildings become stories. And today's story could be never-ending, quite literally. Today we are going to talk about the Sagrada Familia by Antoni Gaudí in Barcelona. This is a building we could talk about for days, but I'll try my best to boil it down to the most important parts of this magnificent building story and condense it into the length of an average episode. Okay, maybe a little bit more than that. But before we dive into today's story, like always, just a quick reminder that you can follow Architecture Topics on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcast, or wherever you listen to make sure you don't miss future episodes. Perfect. Now, with that out of the way, let's travel back to the Barcelona of the late 1800s, a city full of ambition, buzzing factories, expanding streets, and dreaming artists. This was a moment of transformation, of industrial power and cultural pride. The Gothic quarter was still the heart, but l'Eixample was stretching the city outward. Remember, l'Eixample is the iconic master plan designed by engineer Ildefons Cerdà, the grid that gives Barcelona its distinctive pattern, studied by urbanists all over the world today. But at the time, it was still just a vision of what Barcelona could become. As Barcelona expanded, so did its ambitions and its religion. The late 19th century was not just about factories and boulevards. It was also a time of deep religious fervor. Catholic associations flourished in Catalonia, eager to remind the city's restless modernity of its spiritual roots. One of those associations was the Spiritual Association of Devotees of St. Joseph, a modest but determined group of lay people. They had a simple idea: build a church dedicated to the Holy Family, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, as a kind of spiritual antidote to the secularism creeping into urban life. The church would be entirely funded by donations, no royal patron or wealthy aristocrat footing the bill. Just ordinary believers giving what they could. They started by purchasing a large, undeveloped plot in what was then called El Poble, a semi-rural area of fields and small workshops. At the time, this was on the outskirts of Barcelona, technically outside the urbanized area of the Eixample grid. The association deliberately chose this location because it was relatively affordable and open. A blank canvas for their vision. The point here that I want you to remember is that they didn't inherit the land from the church or get a prime city center site handed to them. This wasn't a cathedral commission. It was a humble grassroots project. With the land secured, they commissioned the project to Francisco de Paula del Villar. He was a respected local architect, known for his conventional neo-Gothic work, and that's exactly what he proposed: a perfectly respectable Gothic revival church. Pointed arches, ribbed vaults, nothing revolutionary, but dignified. In 1882, the project broke ground. They laid the cornerstone on St. Joseph's Day, March 19th, and began building the crypt. For a few months, construction moved forward quietly under Villar's direction. But just within a year, Villar resigned. Accounts differ. Some say it was over disagreements with the association, others that he simply got tired of the project. Either way, his departure left the door open. The Spiritual Association needed a new architect, and quickly. The crypt was already underway, and they couldn't leave the project idle for long. They asked for recommendations from within Barcelona's architectural circles, and one name came up: Antoni Gaudí. At the time, Gaudi was only 31 years old. He was young, unproven, and still building his reputation. But he had already made a name for himself as something of a prodigy and something of an eccentric. He had recently completed the gates and pavilions for the Güell family's estate, where his flair for organic forms and meticulous craft had impressed Barcelona's elite. He was also deeply Catholic, which reassured the association. They wanted someone who understood the spiritual purpose of the project, not just the stone and mortar. There was also practicality. Gaudi was available, affordable, and eager to take on a major commission. For him, this was an opportunity to prove himself on a grand scale. And so, by the end of 1883, Antoni Gaudí was appointed lead architect of the Sagrada Familia. At first, he continued building the crypt more or less in line with Villar's plans. But quietly, he began reimagining the church entirely, not as a modest neo-Gothic structure, but as something no one in Barcelona had ever seen before. Gaudi was never one to think small. His plan was audacious. For him, this was more than a church. It was a kind of living Bible in stone, a temple that would tell the story of Christianity through architecture itself. The church would have 3 monumental facades, each one narrating a chapter of Christ's life: the Nativity, the Passion, and the Glory. Together, they would form a narrative path of birth, death, and resurrection. And above each of those facades would rise 4 towers, slender spiraling cones of stone, each one laced with openings that would make them seem almost weightless. In total, 12 towers, 1 for each of the apostles. He also envisioned a colossal central tower dedicated to Jesus Christ, soaring 172.5 meters into the sky, taller than any church tower in the world. To give you an idea, that's more than twice the height of Barcelona's cathedral. Higher than the Great Pyramid of Giza and higher than St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican City. However, it is just slightly shorter than Montjuic Hill because Gaudi believed no work of man should ever rise higher than God's creation. That central tower would be flanked by 4 slightly smaller ones, dedicated to the evangelists, and a final one for the Virgin Mary, crowned with a star. Every tower carried meaning. Every proportion was deliberate. Even their heights expressed a spiritual hierarchy. Apostles below, evangelists higher, Mary higher still, and Christ at the very summit. But Gaudi didn't just want to tell a story. He wanted to evoke the divine through form, light, and space. He abandoned the flat, predictable planes of neo-Gothic architecture and instead turned to nature for inspiration. Look at the columns of the Sagrada Familia, and you can see it immediately. They rise like tree trunks, branch into smaller limbs as they reach the ceiling, and create a canopy of stone that filters light like a forest. He used geometric forms that no one had dared to try at this scale. Parabolas, hyperboloids, helical spirals. He believed these weren't just mathematically efficient. They were the forms that God himself had written into the natural world. Even his approach to ornamentation was deeply symbolic. Every surface would carry meaning. Biblical figures, animals, plants, celestial bodies, all woven together into a tapestry of faith. All this was not simple, as you can imagine. But Gaudi was not in a hurry. He famously said, "My client is not in a hurry," referring to God. From the beginning, he knew that he would not live to see the building finished, but that never deterred him. His goal wasn't speed, it was perfection and devotion. Naturally, the association hesitated at first. Gaudi's design was expensive, time-consuming, and full of ideas they didn't entirely understand. But his deep religious devotion and his ability to fundraise kept them on his side. Gaudi himself became tireless in securing donations. He cultivated wealthy patrons and gave lectures to raise money. That personal involvement reassured the association that the project would remain viable and holy under his direction. By the time the crypt was completed and construction moved on to the Nativity facade, around 1894, his vision had fully taken over. By then, the association had largely stepped back and left the artistic decisions to him. In many ways, his growing reputation, his faith, and his charisma made him impossible to overrule. So it wasn't instant approval, It was a process of winning their confidence and proving that his radical ideas could still serve the church's spiritual mission. And so construction moved forward slowly but surely. The nativity facade began to rise, stone by stone, in the 1890s. And with it, Gaudi's vision finally became visible to the city. Let's not sugarcoat it. People were shocked. Here was a church facade covered in an almost overwhelming profusion of figures: angels and shepherds, birds and vines, turtles crawling at its base, chameleons clinging to the stone. It was alive, almost writhing with symbolism and devotion. To some, it was breathtaking, a glimpse of heaven rendered in stone. To others, it was chaotic, even grotesque. Critics in Barcelona's modernist circles scoffed, calling it old-fashioned and excessive. Some in the church hierarchy quietly muttered that he was taking too many liberties with sacred architecture. But Gaudi didn't care. He grew more and more attached to the work. In his final years, he withdrew almost entirely from public life, stopped taking other commissions, and moved into a tiny workshop on site. He slept on a cot. He ate very little. Visitors who came to see him often found him covered in dust, perched on scaffolding, inspecting the tiniest details of his creation. What other architect have you heard of with this level of commitment? For him, the Sagrada Familia had become everything: his cathedral, his monastery, his universe. And then, one morning in June of 1926, he was walking through the streets near the site when he was struck by a tram. He was taken to a hospital, but he never recovered. Gaudi died 3 days later at the age of 73. At the time of his death, only a small part of his grand vision had been realized: the crypt, the apse, and the soaring nativity facade. The rest, the towers, the glory facade, the immense interior, still existed only in his drawings, his models, and his imagination. After Gaudi's death, the future of the Sagrada Familia was anything but certain. Work continued, at first, under the direction of his collaborators, who tried their best to interpret his models and drawings, but progress was slow. And then, in 1936, the Spanish Civil War broke out and brought everything to a standstill. The site was vandalized. Parts of the crypt were burned. And most devastating of all, many of Gaudi's detailed models, plans, and sketches were destroyed by fire. Decades of his meticulous thinking gone overnight. When the war ended, the question on everyone's mind was, should they even continue? Some argued it was sacrilegious to try. Without Gaudi, they said, the vision could never truly be realized. Better to leave it unfinished, a kind of open-ended monument to his genius. But others saw it as their duty, to Gaudi, to Barcelona, and to God, to keep building. And so slowly the work resumed. For decades, it crawled forward. Piece by piece, interpreted from the fragments of his surviving models and from the memory of those who had worked with him. Each new architect brought a slightly different hand to the work, sparking endless debates about authenticity. Was this still Gaudi's church, or was it something else entirely? In time, though, new technologies came to the rescue. Computer modeling, 3D scanning, even 3D printing. These tools allowed the team to reconstruct much of what was lost, to solve complex geometries that had baffled earlier generations, and to accelerate the pace of construction. And as the towers began to rise higher and the great interior took shape, something else began to happen. Public opinion shifted. What had once been divisive and controversial slowly became beloved. The Sagrada Familia transformed into Barcelona's most iconic symbol, a monument to the city's creativity, its faith, and its stubbornness. By the time the 20th century reached its midpoint, the Sagrada Familia stood not on the outskirts anymore, but at the heart of a bustling neighborhood. When construction began in 1882, the site really was little more than farmland on the very edge of the Eixample. But over the decades, as Cerdà's grid crept outward, block by block, the city grew right up to the church's doorstep. The once isolated fields of El Poble gave way to streets, squares, tram lines, and apartment buildings. By the 1920s and 30s, the Eixample had effectively absorbed the area completely. In a way, the city and the church grew up together. One horizontal and modern, the other vertical and timeless. As for its fame, that too grew, although slowly and unevenly. Tourism started picking up during the Franco dictatorship, particularly by the 1950s and 60s, as Spain opened its doors to foreign tourism for economic reasons. By that time, the Sagrada Familia was already considered a curiosity. Travel writers called it strange, even bizarre, but unforgettable. Pilgrims still came, of course, but so did artists, architects, and an increasing number of international travelers, eager to see Gaudi's unfinished dream for themselves. By the late 1970s, after Franco's death and Spain's return to democracy, Barcelona began to rediscover and embrace its own Catalan identity more openly. And the Sagrada Familia, long associated with that identity and with Gaudi's genius, started to be celebrated more widely as a symbol of the city. Fast forward to the late 80s and early 90s. As Barcelona prepared to host the 1992 Olympics, a moment that put the city on the world stage, the Sagrada Familia was already one of its biggest draws, despite still being very much a construction site. And by the turn of the 21st century, millions of people were visiting each year, walking past the cranes and scaffolding, gazing up at the towers, trying to imagine what it would look like someday. And talking about visitors. Remember the Spiritual Association of Devotees of St. Joseph? The one who originally commissioned the project? The original association eventually dissolved. But its legal and spiritual successor, a private non-profit foundation called Junta Constructora del Temple Expiatorio de la Sagrada Familia, still owns the land and the building, which they still finance through donations and ticket sales. Then, in 2005, UNESCO finally recognized parts of Gaudi's work on the Sagrada Familia, including the Nativity facade and the crypt, as a World Heritage Site. A reminder that even unfinished, it already belonged to the world. Just a few years later, in 2010, the church reached another milestone. After more than a century of construction, the interior was finally finished to the point where it could function as a proper place of worship. The great nave, with its soaring forest of stone columns and kaleidoscope of colored light, was ready to welcome its first full congregation. That November, Pope Benedict XVI visited Barcelona to consecrate the Sagrada Familia as a basilica. The service, attended by thousands, filled the air with incense, organ music, and the kind of hushed reverence Gaudi himself had always imagined for the space. It was a moment of triumph, and also a kind of vindication. For the first time in its long, messy, improbable history, the Sagrada Familia wasn't just a construction site. It was a living church. But of course, the work didn't stop. The towers continued to rise. The intricate details of the glory facade, the final, most ambitious of the three, moved forward bit by painstaking bit. New milestones came and went, each one celebrated as another step toward completion, whatever completion really means for a building like this. As of 2025, the Sagrada Familia still cranes above the skyline, still wrapped in scaffolding, still humming with the sounds of stonecutters and masons. The current goal is to finish it by 2033, marking 150 years since construction began. But few would be surprised if that date slips again. And maybe that's part of the point. It was never about speed. Never about efficiency. It was about devotion, patience, faith in something bigger than yourself. Even now, 140 years on, the Sagrada Familia reminds us that some dreams are worth taking your time to build. The Sagrada Familia is a building that defies categories. At once, a church, a construction site, a monument, a symbol, at once fragile and eternal. It's a reminder that in architecture, as in life, sometimes what we finish isn't as important as what we dare to begin, even knowing we may never see the end. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Barcelona's most iconic work in progress. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to follow Architecture Topics on your favorite platform and leave a rating to help others discover these stories too. I'm Liam Karen, and I'll see you next time. Until then, keep looking up.